Well, actually, that's a good point. If the Iranian defenses were weakened the way in which the Americans like to claim and the Israeli regime like to claim, does anyone really think that Netanyahu and the Americans would refrain from striking Iran? Of course not. They would use that opportunity to strike again and again and again. If Iran did not have adequate defenses, and if it did not have adequate offensive capabilities, they would never refrain from attacking. So I think that's pretty clear. And again, as I said, the Iranians, we all recall how Iran struck Israel with almost 200 missiles. They almost all went through their defenses. And if the United States makes a foolish move, the Iranians will strike very hard. And it's very simple for Iran to be very blunt. The small, tiny Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, which host U.S. bases, uh, if anything happens, they will no longer be exporting oil or gas, and that would bring the global energy markets. Uh, that would bring about that would create chaos. The price of oil would go up to maybe $300, $400 a barrel. That would lead to a global economic depression. And so all of those oil and gas facilities in the Persian Gulf, all of those tankers are easily destroyed. It's a very small. If anyone looks at the Persian Gulf, it's narrow and long, and so everything is very vulnerable. If the Americans could not defeat Ansarullah in the Red Sea after 15, 16 months, then there's not a chance in the world that they're going to be able to defeat the Iranians, especially since the Iranians have been preparing themselves for such a day, for such a possibility for decades. And just today, the Iranians have shown that they have another underground missile base. So the Iranians have these missile bases across the world, across the country, across the Persian Gulf, and I think the Americans recognize that. So the Iranians, I think it is a show of force, and we've seen that over the past few weeks, the Iranians have been carrying out extensive maneuvers. It is a show of strength, both to telling the Trump and his people that any mistake in this region would be fatal for the global economy. It would be fatal for the U.S. economy. No one would win.
It seems like the Western media is actually right now in the throes of an effort to promote increasing escalations on Iran, which may have prompted Agachi, the foreign minister of Iran, to make these comments about how an all-out war would occur if its nuclear sites are hit by the United States and or Israel. Because at the moment, you just look at the headlines. There's rumors about an 1,800-mile radius nuclear site producing nuclear weapons that can reach Europe. There's also a lot of talk about how to prevent Iran from producing nuclear weapons. Is the United States and Israel right now gearing up as they regroup from this embarrassment that just happened in Gaza? Are they gearing up to try to provoke and maybe escalate with Iran as the Trump administration moves forward, Professor Marandi?
Well, this news about Iran developing a nuclear weapon, that's all fake news. That's the sort of fake news that you're going to see from the Western media whenever the West wants to put pressure on some adversary. We saw that in the Iraq War. When they invaded Iraq, they lied about chemical weapons, they lied about nuclear weapons, they lied about Al Qaeda. We saw them lie their way into Libya. That we saw them, just uh, in the dirty war in Syria. Tulsi Gabbard has exposed a lot of the reality of what happened uh, during the when she was in the testifying, or when she was trying to get her confirmation in the confirmation hearing. She exposed the fact that what we've been saying all along, that this was a dirty war, that that the chemical weapon the claims that President Assad used chemical weapons or the Syrian government used chemical weapons was a lie. All of these things that we've been saying for 13 years, and the Western media has been just repeating because that's what their masters have been telling them to do. All of them have been exposed. So these are just new lies that Western media is putting out because they have a vested interest in these or those people behind the media, they have a vested interest in intensifying tensions. And without a doubt, the Israelis would like to see a war. They would be more than willing to sacrifice the United States or the Europeans or the global economy for their own uh, selfish interests. They never cared about the West. They've destroyed the image and the credibility of the West by carrying out this Holocaust for the last 15, 16 months. The West has paid the price in the sense that they have no credibility across the world. The world sees the West as barbaric and inhumane, the Western elites and the regimes that are in power. So Israel, is more than willing to sacrifice everyone for itself. But the United States does recognize Iran's power. Remember, when the United States took Iraq, when they took Afghanistan, they had literally surrounded Iran. And Iran back then was much weaker. Iran back then was much weaker than it is today. And even then, the United States did not dare attack Iran. So the country was surrounded. Iran was in a much more vulnerable position. The United States was at the height of its power. It was the global hyperpower. But it didn't attack Iran because they knew it wasn't a war they could win. Everyone would lose. Today, Iran is much more powerful, and the United States is relatively weaker. They've been losing war after war, spending countless trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and elsewhere, and now in Ukraine. So this is not a war that the Americans can fight against Iran and win.
As you were talking, Professor Marandi, it reminded me that, there's been more than a few people who've been very critical of Iran, even those who supported Palestine and the axis of resistance as a whole, about the slowness of their response, and even about their potential, the leadership under Pezeshkian, wanting to negotiate with the United States around a potential nuclear deal, sanctions, etc. Some even accusing Iran of liberalizing, going that far. But so far, the Iranian government appears to have taken a posture of there's really no possibility of talks at the moment with the United States, given what the U.S. is currently offering and how it's currently behaving. What have you made of this in terms of the overall posture of Iran toward the U.S. as the Trump administration has entered, and this talk about Iran's defiance and resistance toward the U.S. and Israeli regime versus its willingness to negotiate?
Well, if we go back to 2015 during the nuclear negotiations, even though I believe that the nuclear deal was pretty flawed and that it could have been better negotiated, and that the Rouhani administration put the negotiators in a very bad position for a host of reasons, which I don't want to get into right now. But even back then, when Iran was weaker than today and the United States was stronger, uh, the United States and Iran, when they signed the deal, it had nothing to do with Iran, the axis of resistance. Iran's support for Hezbollah had nothing to do with the deal. Iran's support for the popular mobilization forces in Iraq had nothing to do with the nuclear deal. Iran's support for Ansarullah, or what the West likes to call the Houthis in Yemen and the Yemeni government, was not a part of any deal. So even if at some point the Iranians do negotiate with the Americans, that has nothing to do with Iran's support for the axis of resistance. I find it very strange that some people say that Iran is using the axis of resistance in order to strike a deal with the Americans. Well, if Iran didn't have the axis, if Iran didn't support the axis of resistance in the first place, if it did not create the axis of resistance in the first place, it wouldn't have a problem with the United States to have the need for some sort of deal today. Iran has been living with maximum pressure sanctions for 15 years now, or even more. And we've had sanctions since the beginning of the revolution. So since the beginning of the revolution, we had sanctions, and they just increased year after year. And Iran has been supporting these groups, funding these groups, so they paid a heavy price for the axis of resistance. So that's nonsense. And these claims made against Iran are usually made by people who do nothing for the resistance themselves. At most, they fire off a few tweets, but they don't do anything. They don't force their governments to change their stance. All the governments in the region, or at least most of them, are collaborating with the Israelis. Turkey, the Turkish government is doing business as usual, sending oil from Baku. Baku has just signed a deal with the Israeli regime to buy 10% of a an investment in a gas field in the Mediterranean. Egypt is doing business with the Israelis. So is Jordan. So is the Emirates. So, those people who are making these claims against Iran, I think what they're basically doing is they're trying to whitewash or they're trying to muddy the water so that people don't look at what their own governments have been doing and what the governments that they've been supporting have been doing. They're trying to whitewash these regimes. So Iran will continue. I mean, I don't know if there's going to be negotiations between Iran and the United States. Iran will be much tougher with the United States than it was in 2015, because we saw how the United States violated its commitments back then. And it's not just with Iran. The Minsk Accords is a similar experience. The Americans and the Europeans, in general, they are unreliable. We saw how the former German Chancellor Merkel admitted that they had never intended to abide by the Minsk Accords. We saw Hollande say the same thing soon afterwards, and then the former president of Ukraine. This is how the West deals with the rest of the world. So if there are negotiations at some point, and right now the Iranians are being very tough. You can see, as you rightly pointed out, what the interview that the foreign minister made shows that the Iranians are not going to be giving any unnecessary concessions to anyone. So at this stage, I think that nothing is really happening between Iran and the United States. If at some point the Americans decide to be sane and put a very reasonable offer to the Iranians, then it's possible that there will be negotiations. But as I said, that has nothing to do with the axis of resistance, just as it never had anything to do with the axis of resistance in the past. And one final point is that if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, Iran would have had it a long time ago. Iran is today, thanks to Trump, one of the 10 most advanced countries in nuclear energy. One of the 10 most advanced countries in the world. So Iran could develop a nuclear weapon whenever it wants. And we know how Iranian drone and missile technology, how advanced that is, and how developed Iran is in that regard. It's very simple for Iran. The point is that the Iranians never wanted a nuclear weapon because the nuclear weapons are horrible for the world. And not only would they cause instability because then other countries would want them, but also Iran just doesn't like these sort of weapons. I think it's very difficult for some people in the West to comprehend that the Islamic Republic of Iran is much more humane than Western regimes. And let me give you an example. During the 1980s, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against Iran, and I survived two chemical attacks, one mustard gas attack in 1988 and one nerve agent in 1984 during the Khaybar operation. The Iranian commanders and leaders went to the leader back then and said we should develop chemical weapons, just like Saddam Hussein. And he said no. He said no, we are not going to develop and use chemical weapons. So Iran paid a price. And Western countries not only gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, they banned Iran, they prevented other countries from selling Iran gas masks. They prevented Iran from obtaining the materials to defend themselves from chemical weapons. That is how Western regimes behave. And that's how Iran behaved. And today, those same regimes are supporting genocide in Gaza, and Iran is the lone country, alongside Yemen, of course, that is standing against the genocide. So whenever Westerners try to, Western elites and think tanks and media, when they talk about human rights in Iran, I always find it ridiculous, because I've survived chemical attacks. I couldn't breathe because of chemical attacks. I lived through chemical attacks. I'll never believe any Western media outlet that pretends that they care about human dignity and human rights. So when the Iranians say that they don't want nuclear weapons because it is immoral and it kills innocent people, they're very serious, and history has shown that they're consistent. However, the Iranians have said that if there's an existential threat to the country, then they will change their nuclear posture. They've been very explicit about that, which is understandable. So that's not where Iran wants to go. And Americans, if they're foolish enough, then Iran will be forced to change its position.
And it's an extraordinary position, Professor Marandi, given the dirty little secret of the fact that Israel is in possession of nuclear weapons, and that Israel has shown through its behavior in the region that it is willing to go to great lengths militarily to get what it wants, to the point of now what we witness is genocide. So it's an extraordinary position for Iran. And if you could comment on that, on the fact that the biggest players, Israel and of course the United States too, both are nuclear powers with nuclear weapons, and both, while Israel hasn't necessarily used one that we know of, the United States has, and Israel has a long record of absolute aggression in the region, which obviously has Iran on very high alert. Your thoughts?
Well, the Iranian nuclear program, the peaceful nuclear program, is very well protected because the United States is a lawless regime, because the Europeans are lawless regimes. They've constantly threatened Iran with military strikes over the years. All options are on the table. The West can threaten countries whenever they like, because for them, international law means nothing. For them, the international law is for the others. It's for the non-Western governments. They have to abide by commitments. They have to abide by the international law. The nuclear deal with Iran was a good example. Obama, from day one, began to violate the deal, but the Iranians were forced to abide by their commitments. Of course, in future, that's not going to happen. Iran won't accept that sort of deal. But the point is that the West sees itself as above the law. They see themselves as exceptional. American exceptionalism is basically that very same thing. They see themselves as having more rights than others, more privileges than others. And that's why the Iranians have been forced to protect their nuclear program and build it very, very deep underground, so that if the Americans or the Israelis or anyone else tries to bomb it, they will fail to destroy it. So that, and of course, Iran has extensive air defenses around it too. So uh, and as you pointed out, that not only have the Americans used chemical weapons, but the Israeli regime is a genocidal regime. And this genocidal regime has already had senior government officials threaten and people with nuclear weapons. We saw a minister in the Israeli cabinet speak about using a nuclear weapon in Gaza at the beginning of the genocide. And on numerous occasions, Netanyahu, this genocidal monster, went to where they have their nuclear program and made threats against Iran from there, basically implying that the Israeli regime can use nuclear weapons. So I think Iran is in a position. It's being very smart. They have the capability, and that it's is deterrence. It's a threshold state, but they don't want the bomb. And as I said, if they wanted it, they would have had it a long time ago. And there's nothing that the Americans could have done about it. And there's nothing they can do about it today. And that, I think, the smartest thing is to do one's best to prevent nuclear war, because that would bring about the end of humanity. If there's a nuclear exchange anywhere in this world, that will have huge consequences. And of course, if it's between the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians, that would bring an end to everything. But a nuclear war, whether between India and Pakistan or in our region, that will have consequences for the entire globe that will be irreversible.